Hey AP Bio, it's me, Miss Willis, and I'm here to talk to you today about evolution and, of course, natural selection as a way to explain how evolution occurs. So let's go ahead and dive into those basics. The first thing that we need to address, of course, is the basic fundamental definition of evolution. And evolution is the change in the allele frequency of a gene pool in a population over time. So what does that really mean? Well, in very common, simple terms, it means that organisms, they change through time. But if we look at it at a microscopic level, really what is changing is the genes, and specifically the versions of those genes called the alleles that are changing in a population's gene pool through time. If you have all watched the video from TED Ed, the 5 Fingers of Evolution, you will remember that there are 5 processes that can cause evolution to occur. So there are 5 things that can cause this change to occur. Number one, your pinky finger represented the population size. So smaller populations are definitely more susceptible to genetic drift or change, and we'll talk more about that later. We also have the ring finger representing mating, and specifically non-random mating can cause evolution to occur. We have mutations can definitely cause evolution and things to change over time. Gene flow, which is represented with your pointer finger, so the movement of populations, specifically things leaving or coming into populations, can cause evolution to occur. And lastly, natural selection. So organisms that are best fit will survive and pass on their traits to their offspring. This does lead to what are called adaptations, and that was represented by the thumb. So all of these processes are things that can cause evolution to occur. Diving deeper into evolution, you're going to see that there are 2 different types of change. There's microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is when small changes happen in a population. So maybe the DNA gets mutated and that evolves into a different color, for example, you see here in the beetles. So these are very, very small changes that happen. Compare that to macroevolution. This is where you have big changes that occur in populations. And these big changes can lead to what's called speciation, or the process of creating a new species. And you know when a new species has been created because it won't mate with the species that it originated from. So when you get 2 distinct populations and they are no longer mating and they don't produce viable offspring, you have now created a new species. If you have studied evolution before, you have probably come across this man. So I want you to think about what you possibly know about Charles Darwin. Number one, you probably know he has something to do with natural selection. When he was younger, he went on a boat called the HMS Beagle. It took him around the world. He was a naturalist. He observed lots of different creatures. He noticed that the world was quite biodiverse. All of these observations from his time studying led him to create what is called the natural selection theory. And so what he did with natural selection was pretty much give a reason, an explanation for how evolution happens. In his theory of natural selection, he basically said that nature selects which organisms are better suited for their environment. And if they had the favorable phenotypes or physical characteristics for that environment, then they would survive and pass on those traits to their offspring. And this would occur after generation and generation, so that it would eventually lead to the change in a population. And some of those changes, of course, were things like adaptations. There were 4 things that Darwin said needed to occur for natural selection. One of them was that there was reproduction with the species and there was an reproduction of organisms. 2, that the traits had to be inheritable. They were passed on through generation to generation. 3, there had to be variation within the individuals of the population. And 4, there had to be fitness differences in that organism population. So you definitely had to have some that were able to survive and pass on their traits and some that were not. So what is evolutionary fitness? Well, in Darwin's term, fitness just means you have the ability to reproduce. So if we call you fit, that means you can reproduce and of course pass on those traits to your offspring. And fitness is measured by reproductive success. So how successful are you at reproducing? So those organisms that are the most fit in terms of Darwin's natural selection are those that can have the most offspring and also live the longest and of course have offspring throughout their lifetime. What you're looking at right now is an organism called a zorse. It's actually technically a hybrid of a horse and a zebra. And yes, this actually exists. It's not made up. So why is this horse not evolutionary fit? Well, if we tie it into Darwin's fitness definition, a zorse is not evolutionary fit because zorses cannot have viable offspring. They cannot reproduce, as is the case with most hybrids. A hybrid species, well, a hybrid is an organism that is created from 2 different species. So it does kind of violate, I guess you could say, natural rules of mating and reproduction, but it is technically not its own species because it cannot mate and it cannot have viable offspring. So because of that, it is definitely not fit because it cannot reproduce and pass on those traits to its offspring. In natural selection, you will hear this word a lot, and it's an adaptation. What specifically is an adaptation? Well, it is a genetic variation that is favored in the selection process. And because it is favored, it gives that organism an advantage. And of course, if it can have that advantage, it hopefully will be able to survive and pass on those traits. But this adaptation only occurs through environmental pressure. So the environment is selecting which phenotypes or which traits are actually beneficial in that environment. And if it is beneficial, then it will stay. And if it's not, it usually gets phased out. Please remember that natural selection works on organisms' phenotypes, or what they physically look like. So environments may change, and you may remember the peppered moth story from regular biology. The environment changed, and of course, because the environment changed, that led to one type of moth being more favorable than the other. But ultimately, nature was selecting based upon what those moths look like, essentially what their phenotype was. And also remember that genetic variation in a population is extremely beneficial for that population. If there are different individuals in your population and the environment changes, that means there's a more likelihood that some of those individuals will not be susceptible to that change or that disturbance. So that means they'll be able to survive, and ultimately your population will survive. But if they're not varied and they're not different and something happens, then of course all of them will be affected and it will hurt the genetic diversity of that population. The last things that I wanted to talk about is evolution is random. There are 3 things that can, of course, cause evolution to happen, but when and how those things happen, it's anyone's guess. So of course you have mutations that can cause evolution to happen. You have genetic drift and gene flow. A mutation is a change in the genetic information of an individual. It can be random or it can be caused by things called mutagens, which actually cause the mutation. Please keep in mind that sometimes mutations are not always bad. I know a lot of people think mutations, they tend to be very negative. But mutations can also be positive, especially if it leads to some sort of adaptation or trait that is beneficial in that environment. And They can also be neutral. So sometimes the genetic information changes, but it leads to really no phenotypic trait difference because of the coding in the amino acid sequence. Genetic drift is also random. These are random changes that can happen in populations. And there's two different kinds. You probably have seen bottleneck effects in AP Environmental. And this is when you have a big population and something cuts down the population size so that only a few individuals are left. And then those few individuals obviously reproduce and build the population back up. But because you cut down a number of those individuals in the original population, you are left with very little genetic variation in the remaining population. In the founder effect, what you have is a small group of individuals breaking off from a population and going to essentially found a new population in a different area. That's usually done through migration. And of course, that can also cut down the genetic variety of a population, especially if the ones that broke off are all the same. And lastly, one of the things that can also cause evolution to occur is gene flow. So the movement of organisms in and out of a population definitely also moves the genetic material in and out of that population. And so if things move in, you may get an increase of genetic variation. If things leave, that may lead to a decrease of genetic variation. But all of that movement does definitely influence the allele frequency in a population and how that changes through time. Okay, everyone, that concludes the basics of evolution and natural selection. I will see you soon.